Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Megan Clark in the Theology Department and the Faculty Chair for our St. John's Catholic Relief Services Campus Committee. We are pleased to welcome today, virtually, Meera Karunananthan, who is a water campaigner and director of the Blue Planet Project in Canada. She is pursuing her PhD in geography at the University of Ottawa and has worked on water rights and the rights of nature for many years. I had the privilege of being on a panel a couple of years ago with Meera at the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. And so I am sorry that we are not able right now to in person welcome her to St. John's, but I am very grateful for her willingness to roll with technology during the pandemic so that we can still share and have our Global Justice Earth Day lecture. I will now turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of your Earth Day celebration and lecture. Hello to all of your students. I just thought I'd talk, because of the context today, about water justice advocacy and work in times of crisis. I'll say a few words about the Blue Planet Project to start. We are a water justice organization. We work internationally. We work at different levels. Globally, we work on global policy issues. We met at the UN when we were working on promoting the human right to water in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. We've also worked on national policy projects. But in the last little while, a lot of our organizing and advocacy work has focused on community-based work and what we call translocal organizing, where we support networks that bring together impacted communities with solidarity-based NGOs and activist researchers, faith-based groups, trade unions, to support solution building and at the grassroots level, at the community level, led by those who are most impacted by water crises. So as you mentioned, I'm also doing a PhD in human geography at the University of Ottawa. And my work, my PhD work, is focused on some of the work we've been doing in South Africa, looking at access to water, struggles for access to water from a feminist, gendered perspective. My work is also very much rooted in the school of thought that's known as political ecology. So I thought I'd start with that. When we look at crisis, it's important to think about nature and the environment and environmental crisis not as something that is separate from what is happening socially. So we talk about socio-natures of racial capitalism. Political ecologists challenge this false dichotomy between nature and society. And in some cases, you can see how dangerous that is when you look at the kinds of solutions that are being promoted that look at nature in a very piecemeal way. Let's save this lake, let's save this mountain, as opposed to looking more holistically at what's going on with the system. And also the importance of seeing human beings not as separate from that system, but as an important part of that system. Human life itself is a combination of biophysical and social processes. So we are not separate from nature, and we often talk about human nature and non-human nature to highlight this idea that nature is a system that's co-produced by biophysical and social processes. And this is very clear when you look at the COVID-19 crisis, that not only are we not separate from nature, but our relationship with these environmental processes are also determined by power dynamics and what's happening, also by it's also shaped by our social location, what we call our social location. So your racial background, gender, class, that these factors intersect with how we relate with the environment and how environmental processes impact us. So if you look at the COVID-19 crisis, this becomes extremely clear. Many have said that the virus is a great leveler because it doesn't distinguish between rich and poor, that rich and powerful people are getting impacted by the crisis, by the disease. But if you look at the data that's emerging, this is simply not true. Despite the fact that you do have famous people and rich people and decision makers who are getting sick. We also know now from the emerging data, if you look at what's happening in the United States, and it's important to note too that the CDC has not been providing this kind of segregated data that looks at race, and so the Washington Post, other media outlets have actually put together their own analysis, and academics have started to put together their analysis. And recently released Washington Post analysis showed that the counties that are majority Black have 3 times the rate of infection and almost 6 times the rates of death as counties where white residents are in the majority. In Michigan, out of the 845 reported deaths, the Washington Post found roughly 40% were African American, despite only 14% of the population being African American. More than a quarter of the deaths in Michigan actually occurred in the city of Detroit, where African Americans make up 79% of the population. So we know from looking at the emerging data in the United States that if you're racialized, you're more, already, we know that you're more likely to be poor, but if you're poor and racialized, you're less likely to have access to testing, to healthcare services. You're more likely to have the predetermined conditions that make you more vulnerable to complications and death. And these predetermined conditions are also caused by a lifetime of living in poverty, right? So we know, because we've been working with groups in the city of Detroit for many years, that one very important factor in Detroit is that there have been shutoffs, water shutoffs, to tens of thousands of people who are unable to pay their bills. And as a colleague, Maureen Taylor from the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization has pointed out, if hand washing is the first line of defense against COVID-19, then people who don't have access to water to wash their hands are going to be much more vulnerable. Now, there has been a big push, and both the governor of the state of Michigan and the mayor of the city of Detroit have announced that taps are being turned back on. They haven't provided a long-term solution to that situation, so the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and the People's Water Board in Detroit are pushing for not only for the taps to be turned back on, but for them to stay on. But because they've been in that situation for many years now, it's really hard to get those taps turned back on. Some of the homes, the pipes aren't working properly, and so it's taking a while for people to be reconnected to their access to water. So again, instead of looking at environmental destruction or environmental crisis as something that is separate from human lives, it's important to ask the question about it's important to ask who controls these processes, who benefits, and who is adversely impacted. And under the prevailing logic of capitalism, or what many Black scholars and racialized scholars have called racial capitalism, a term that was first coined by Cedric Robinson. You've got a system where racialized communities and racialized communities who live at the intersection of other forms of oppression, including class-based oppression, are going to be much more adversely impacted. I've included in the resources a link to a lecture by Dr. Robin Kelly, looking at what is racial capitalism and what do we do about it, which I think will be very useful, and I encourage students to listen to that lecture. And it argues that all capitalism is racial capitalism, that you don't have, it's not like we have different kinds of capitalism. In some places it's racialized, in other places it's not, because the very foundations of capitalism are rooted in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, and capitalism in the form that it exists, or the forms that it exists today, continue to thrive on the exploitation and oppression of descendants of that legacy, of descendants of the slave trade and descendants of colonialism. So we see this again with the crisis. If you look at some of the frontline workers in grocery stores, the migrant workers who are picking our fruits and vegetables, these are racialized people for the most part. So now on to water crisis. Similarly, we don't look at water crisis as one big singular crisis, but as a system of uneven social, hydrosocial relations. So when groups like the World Economic Forum talk about the failure of climate change adaptation and the looming water crisis that we're seeing in the world, they are in fact reducing a multiplicity of social natural relations to a universal and single phenomenon, in a reductionist manner that obscures some of the political, the complex political and power dynamics that are happening, where uneven social hydrosocial relations are produced. So it's important, if we're looking at water crisis, to not separate that from discussions of colonialism and capitalism, and looking at the different ways in which capitalism has generated these uneven relationships to water in different parts of the world. Again, to quote Maureen from the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization, we just held a webinar, and I've linked to that webinar also in the follow-up resources for students. But we just held a webinar where we invited frontline communities to come share their experiences in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And Maureen talked about the situation in Detroit. She pointed out that it's not that they don't have access to water, or that there's a shortage of water in Detroit. She says, we've got 20% of the world's water. We've got the Great Lakes at our doorstep, and yet tens of thousands of people in Detroit do not have access to water. So it's not a natural phenomenon. It's not that there's a shortage or that there's something going on in the environment. There is something going on politically and socially that has deprived people of their right to water. A lot of our work focuses on fighting the privatization of water and sanitation services. We know from experiences around the world that this is a model that has violently dispossessed people of their right to live a healthy, dignified life. This is a model that was promoted heavily in the 1990s as part of the World Bank's structural adjustment program. So there are loan packages that came with conditions that required governments in the global South to privatize or sell off public assets. But around the world, what we've seen in the last 15 years is people have fought back. And there's been a really successful campaign, or several campaigns at the local level, to push back against the private sector, and many local governments have taken water back into public hands, or local communities have taken water back into public hands. So this is a big success story, is the remunicipalization of water and sanitation services. There's some really important research done by the Transnational Institute and the Public Service International Research Unit, looking at all of these cases of remunicipalization, and they found hundreds of cases around the world where people have reclaimed water into public hands. What we see in the slide here, to me, are two pictures that capture this idea of uneven hydrosocial relations. So in Chile, the bottom slide, you've got, the picture at the bottom is a picture of region in Chile that has been very heavily hit by drought. It's a region called Petorca, but it's also where you've got large agribusiness, so big avocado plantations. So probably many of the avocados people eat in North America come from Chile, and well, Chile and Mexico, so Latin America, and you've got massive pools, massive reservoirs that the avocado industry is using. This is one company to capture water in the desert, really. And if you look around, you can see it's a desert-like landscape. And downstream, you have communities that don't have access to water. And what's happened in Chile, Chile is one of the countries, or the country in the world, where water has been most privatized. So 95% of water and sanitation services are in private hands. But in addition to that, Chile is one of the few countries in the world where they have set up water markets. So rather than having rather than having governments oversee processes to provide permits and licenses, many of those licenses are now privately owned, and they're allowed, when they're done with a license, they are able to sell it on the market and at market price. And so right now in Chile, all of those licenses, all of the water permits have been over allocated. They're mostly in private hands. It also means if you want to sell, you're going to probably sell to a big industry, a big corporation that is able to purchase that permit. And so you've got communities that now don't have access to water. The slide, the picture above, in fact, what I should have done is done a contrast between what Cape Town as a city looks like, which students can Google and look up if you haven't had a direct experience. But Cape Town is a beautiful, modern city with all of the luxuries you can dream of. It's very much like any other European or North American city. And yet you've got huge segments of the population living in townships and informal settlements. And townships are low-income, low-income housing on the outskirts of the city. So the city core has great public services and all the amenities, and the outskirt of the city has very little of that. So there's no public transportation. If you look at how water is distributed during the apartheid era, the infrastructure that was set up to service the city, the homes in the city had big pipes, and then the pipes going out, or sort of larger pipes to their homes, and then the pipes going out into the townships, and the township areas and the areas in the outskirts were very narrow pipes, and so the flow of water to those areas is very low. And the picture on top is of Kailicha, which is the largest township in South Africa, and it's partially informal, so that's one of the informal settlements. There are many in Kailicha. And on the call, on the webinar that we organized a few weeks ago, we had someone from Kailicha talk about one area where there are 4,000 homes with 2 taps. And so South Africa prides itself in providing access to water for everyone, but this is what that access looks like. And so when the city of Cape Town announced it was in a severe crisis in 2018, there was no recognition of the fact that there were all these people living without access to water. And the measures that the severe restrictions that they imposed didn't take into consideration the needs of these communities. And so these communities were further restricted. The flow was cut the flow was reduced. So even in the townships, the already low-flowing water was reduced further, which meant people had to line up, and stand for hours in front of buckets. And I should say, when we talk about racial capitalism, it also has a very gendered impact, right? Because this increases the burden of care for women, the burden of what we call social reproduction labor, women who are responsible for taking care of their families in contexts like this, and have to deal with working harder, working longer hours to ensure that their families survive. So in Cape Town, then we don't really have a situation like in Detroit of privatization necessarily, but we've got, although there are some services that are outsourced, you've got a situation of corporatization where the city acts very much like a private corporation, brings in policies that look very much like that of the private sector of what we call full cost recovery. So it's much more about the financial management of the city services and charging people rates that recover those costs. And in part, this happens when those city services that are vital to our needs are defunded at the national level, which is what you see in the US, it's what we see in Canada. More and more, there's less and less funding for municipal services that are vital. And this is something in our response when we look at what the world looks like after COVID-19, we're going to have to fight very hard for our cities and our public services at the city level to be better funded. So how do we challenge these socio-ecological injustices? We look at things at the Blue, so this is sort of some of the work that we do at the Blue Planet Project. So broadly, our work fits into an eco-socialist perspective. So not only do we talk about collective ownership and even distribution, we also need to deal with sort of the ecological realities and look at patterns of consumption and production. We also work within a framework of what we call environmental justice, which challenges the disproportionate burden borne by communities that live at the intersections of race, gender, class-based, and caste-based oppression. So specifically, we have run campaigns to promote water as a human right. One thing that's really important to highlight is that when we talk about setting things right with the environment, or when we talk about setting things, looking at ecological crisis and what is the correct course for humanity to take, that needs a huge part of what needs to happen is the devaluing of human life that has been the valuing of human life that has been devalued by racial capitalism. And that's where the human right to water has played an important role in our work. There is, an academic debate around this concept of the human right to water. I think human rights in general, whether they actually effectively serve campaigns or strategies to challenge the bigger system that is dispossessing people. But what we've seen with the human right to water is that it's not just a legal tool or just a political tool. It has been effective in some places as a legal tool. It really depends on the local context and the legal system. And in other places, it really hasn't been an effective legal tool. However, it's been a really important advocacy tool in communities around the world. So even though, as far as I know, there is no recognition per se of the human right to water in the state of Michigan or by the US government, the groups in Detroit have really successfully campaigned and advocated for the human right to water as a strategy also to, as a strategy to mobilize communities around their rights, right? Some would argue it is a right regardless of whether the state recognizes it, that they have a moral right to water, and also to highlight and expose the absolute kind of violence of a system that deprives people of access to water and sanitation services. So the human right to water has been a really important mobilizing tool in many communities around the world. A lot of our work also fits into this concept of water as part of the commons, and this is where communities have fought privatization of water and sanitation services, that water should not be provided as a commodity or sold as a commodity. Our campaigns against bottled water, against water markets. The water cannot be sold as a commodity, that we have a right to water. Water is part of what we collectively share. It's part of our collective heritage. Also important to highlight the importance of Indigenous rights in these struggles. And here, not just, although they are important, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and free, prior, and informed consent, but also recognizing, or at least in Canada and North America, the jurisdiction that Indigenous people have over their territory, over their land and resources, that this needs to be part of a campaign for economic justice for Indigenous people. As I mentioned earlier, we've been supporting a lot of grassroots organizing at the local level, led by frontline communities who are directly impacted. And one of the projects that we've gotten off the ground very successfully here in Canada, throughout Europe, and now it's growing in Latin America, is a project called the Blue Communities Project. So it's a project to challenge the privatization and commodification of water at the local level. It's a strategy to get local governments involved in that work, and to promote the recognition of water as a human right at the local level, which has been really important because many groups have faced huge obstacles at the national level. So it's really scaling down a campaign that started at the national level. So what next? I did want to say a few things, about what St. John's University could do and the students at St. John's University could do, recognizing also that it's a theological school, that there's an emphasis on theology, or Catholic school, that I think the work that's being done on these issues of human rights and environmental justice and socioeconomic justice is really important, given the context we're dealing with right now of a rise of the Christian right, and of religious fundamentalism in the U.S. That these groups that were once fringe groups have now taken on positions of power, and that they're influencing policy. And so it's good. What gives me hope is that there's also a tradition of a long history of liberation theology throughout the Americas, in Latin America, certainly in the critique of U.S. imperialism in Latin America, that a lot of that was led by liberation theologists, but also in the U.S., there is a long history of Black liberation theology in the civil rights movement. And wanted to sort of end with this quote by a feminist liberation theologist who is a founder of the Women's Alliance for Theology, Ethics, and Ritual, Mary Hunt. And she says, how can we change our country's attitudes, practices, and structures so that we can share the earth equitably with others? The task for US residents is to subvert from within, refusing to cooperate with or be co-opted by economic, racial, and political forces that oppress so many throughout the world, including poor women and their dependents at home. And I think this is really important in the current context, because the US also has such an important impact on what happens globally. We heard yesterday that the Trump administration was planning to defund the World Health Organization at a time of global pandemic. We also know the US foreign policies have promoted corporate interests over the rights of communities. So there is a role that I think American students and academics looking to engage at the global level can play an important responsibility to influence what's happening in the US, to influence the consciousness of the general public in the US. I've added some reading material that I mentioned during the talk, and depending on people's situation, I've also added some documentaries and lighter stuff for people to view, including a movie, a Hollywood movie called or I think it's a Spanish movie called Even the Rain by some big stars, and so that could be a fun movie night. I did also include, which I recommend, we had a webinar with some of the frontline communities who I quoted and the activists I quoted. So if folks want to look at that, we'll probably be having a webinar again soon. And I invite all of your students to join. You can follow us on Facebook to get more information on that. And to take action, one, it's, get involved locally, join a social movement locally. I think that's always number one. Till April 30th, we have a fundraiser going for the group we work with, one of the groups we work with in Detroit, one in Chile, and one in South Africa. And that'll be up on GoFundMe till April 30th, and 100% of those donations will go to those grassroots organizations directly. And long term, I'd love for us to keep talking about how we can make St. John's University a blue community, and get you sort of more formally involved in our global networks for water justice. I've also included some links to wonderful US organizations we work with if you want to find out more about what's going on in the US and how to plug into what's going on in the US.
Thank you very much, Meera. Before I let you go, I wanted to just ask you to speak a little bit about how it is you ended up focusing on water and how it is you became an environmental justice advocate, and what, if any, advice you would have for students who are considering advocacy as something that either they're interested in pursuing, whether it be environmental or other forms of social justice advocacy, whether as their career or as something that is simply woven into their lives, even if it's not specifically working for an NGO. What advice you would have for them?
Yeah, in terms of how I chose water, I would say there's an extent to which I feel water chose me. Although I started getting involved in, as I think what we called ourselves, anti-globalization activists at the time around 2001, and heard about the Cochabamba struggle, which had just happened in Bolivia, where people took to the streets to fight the privatization of their water services. So the Bolivian government had sold off water to a private water company. Rates were going to go up, and people were outraged, and there was weeks and weeks of street protests, and they managed to put enough pressure on the Bolivian government and got their water back from the private company. And so that was a very inspiring struggle, and it certainly has shaped how I've thought about water, my choice to go into water over the years, and feel very lucky today to be connected with some of those groups in Cochabamba. Marcela Oliveira, who works at the Blue Planet Project, was involved in that struggle. And the other thing I would say about water, though, is that I think it's very much linked to all of these other struggles for socioeconomic justice, for environmental justice. But I think one of the reasons it's really important is it's also where you see the greatest dispossession. It's where you see the most violent excesses of the dominant, capitalist system. If you look at, if you look at how frontline communities are organizing, water is a really, really important aspect of struggles for gender justice, struggles against mining companies, It's a lot about protecting local water sources. So I feel it's connected me to a lot of the great grassroots and frontline groups and campaigns that I think are really important in dealing with bigger systemic issues. For students, I would also say that it's really important. A lot of, what shaped my work as working for an NGO is the training I got in social movement activism. And so I think it's really important to kind of get involved as a starting point, and that will lead you somewhere. I think, of course, I recognize that there's a certain privilege. We don't always get to work where we choose to work. And increasingly kind of these spaces are shrinking. And so I really do think it's important to get involved and to build up social movements, and to get involved in your community if that's what you have access to. And now I think with the internet, right, we can connect internationally much more easily. And so hopefully in connecting with some of the organizations in the resource list, or joining on social media, joining our webinars, I think you can plug into the work that we're doing.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me from your talk and from conversations we've had is that there's such an interconnection between public advocacy more broadly in terms of public accountability and public ownership of the political process that goes along with public ownership and accountability and demanding that when it comes to the environment and our resources. I know as I lived through Sandy and was displaced, and one of the things that was interesting is it really highlighted the way that communities that still had public utilities, including water, but much more of the damage was to electric. But the community I lived in, the ocean had breached the water treatment plant. And so our public water was affected and had to be turned off for that to be fixed as well. Communities that still had public utilities recovered better and more quickly than those that had in the 1980s, late 70s and 80s, privatized their public utilities. And so one of the things, it's just like you to say a little bit about is that this isn't a all or nothing, right? It's not these things were privatized and so they're now lost. But one of the things we've talked about is that the exciting movements to essentially reclaim the commons that are going on in Europe and other parts of the world. So, and I promise it's my last question, but if you could just say a little bit about these movements to reclaim the commons by communities, and how integrated that is, right? It's not automatically that communities are better at managing or governments are better at managing, but it has, right, that the people have to if they stay engaged, the people are better at managing collective interests than when it's handed over to outside entities.
And that's exactly what it is. It isn't necessarily, because that's the argument that comes up, is that there are failed states and that governments can be inefficient or undemocratic, and that is true, but it's the idea that this would be the starting point to reclaim because the private sector is there to make a profit, and that there are some services or that shape our lives and our ability to live happy, dignified lives, and therefore they are sacred. Our public healthcare system, our water and sanitation services, our education system, that these services cannot be provided on a for-profit basis. And so whether or not you've got, perfect public utilities around the world, the reality is that is the starting point, and from there is the possibility of building something better. And what's been great about the remunicipalization movement is that it's, you've got community struggles that are also then anchored in really great research. by groups like the Public Service International Research Unit and the Transnational Institute. And what they've also talked about is that it's, you know, been part of a vision for something better. So it's not just about fighting privatization and reclaiming into public hands, but then those communities have been empowered to push for something better. And we've seen this happen more and more around the world. What these organizations that are supporting these processes are doing as well is that they're sharing best case, and they're sharing case studies, they're sharing good news stories, and inspiring others. And so when we have a good model of how it should operate, that can get replicated elsewhere in the world. And so the documentation that's happened alongside the grassroots organizing against privatization has also been really important. And this is where we've seen the global justice networks work really well. It's bringing together different NGOs, research NGOs, solidarity NGOs with and trade unions and research institutions with frontline communities who are doing the campaigning on the ground. What's also, in terms of public, like reclaiming the public, the other thing, the kind of other big battle right now is reclaiming our policy space and the ways in which corporations are influencing policy. And this is where, we've also focused a lot on the big beverage industry, because we've seen the ways in which corporations like Nestle have been pushing for a seat at the decision-making table, and the ways in which, especially in how that's played out in the global South, because they have the backing of international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank set up a public-private policy group that they call the 2030 Water Resources Group, and it's basically Coca-Cola, Nestle, Pepsi, Rio Tinto, all these big corporations that are fighting battles at the local level with communities who don't want to see their watersheds destroyed by these corporations, have now found themselves with a seat at the decision-making table as policy experts. And so we can imagine what kinds of policies they're promoting. And so it's reclaiming into public hands will also mean reclaiming our policy space, reclaiming the right to decision-making.
Thank you very much. And I hope this is merely the first of many conversations we get to have, and hopefully in the near future, welcome you in person to St. John's.
Great. Thank you, Megan.